or in person, and we have a bit of a coffee hour now. So we're coming back after all the COVID restrictions here. My name is Brita. I'll be the worship assistant for today's service. And our worship leader this morning is Joshua Leach. He is a public policy and communications strategist at the UUSC, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, a human rights organization inspired by UU values. He holds a master's in divinity from Harvard Divinity School and is a candidate for ordination in the UU ministry. He has preached for us before for a number of years. He's just wonderful. He's so energetic. He has such wonderful stories. And we are very, very happy to have him with us here this morning. We'll begin by acknowledging that First Parish Church was built on the unceded land of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people. We acknowledge the connection that they continue to maintain with the land here in this place that we call Billerica. And we acknowledge the hardships they have endured and commit ourselves to caring for the land and to fostering good relationships with our Indigenous neighbors. Here are our opening words.
Thank you so much, Brita. Good morning. Thank you all for being here, both in the sanctuary and on Zoom. Thank you to our technical team for making it possible to be together in both of those formats. Today's service is going to be about victories and what all too often comes after the victories. It's about those times in our lives when we think we have won something permanently, only to realize that the true struggle is just beginning. In our present historical moment, it seems like we're experiencing this very often. I know that I was fortunate enough to be born in a moment in history when it seemed like some of the big problems of the past had perhaps been solved. The Cold War was over, civil rights were the law of the land. We could expect elections every 4 years with a peaceful transfer of power, women's constitutional right to make their own reproductive healthcare decisions was firmly established in the courts, or so it seemed. The world we live in now shows us that these victories were not final. The struggle for each goes on. Violence and injustice are still among us. And so as we reflect on this time of struggle in today's service, and in particular, as we grieve the deaths of innocent people killed by white supremacist violence in Buffalo, New York yesterday, we open this service with a reflection from the poet Adrienne Rich. She writes, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." Please join me in the words of our chalice lighting. Life is a gift for which we are grateful. We gather in community to celebrate the glories and the mysteries of this great gift. Now I invite you to join me as well in singing our opening hymn, number 110 in the hymnal, "Come, Children of Tomorrow."
The earth
invite you as well to join me in the words of our affirmation of faith. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God.
Sometimes in our lives, we all have pain, we all have sorrow, but if we are wise, we know that there's always tomorrow. Lean on me when you're not strong, and I'll be your friend. I'll help you carry on, for it won't be long till I'm gonna need somebody to lean on.
Swallow your pride if I have things you need to borrow, for no one can fill those of your needs that you won't let show.
So just call on me, brother, when you need a hand. We all need someone to lean on. Just might have a problem that you'll understand. We all need somebody to lean on. Lean on me when you're not strong. I'll be your friend. I'll help you carry on. For it won't be long till I'm gonna need somebody to lean on. So just call on me, brother, when you need a hand. We all need someone to lean on. Just might have a problem that you'll understand.
We all
Need somebody to lean on. If there is a load you have to bear that you can't let go, right up the road, I'll share your load if you just call me. Call me. Call me.
Thank you so much, Bob and Suzanne. That was really beautiful and felt very needed for the moment. Today's reading is from a poem by James Russell Lowell, The Present Crisis. Lowell wrote this poem in 1845 as a protest against slavery and against US aggression in the Mexican-American War. In the many years since then, it has inspired many protest movements in our country, from the anti-war movement to movements for civil rights and racial justice. And its words have been echoed by the great orators and liberators of our history, including Dr. Martin Luther King, who often quoted from this poem. As we live in a time of war and invasion globally, and as we see More lives lost to white supremacist violence this weekend as we see threats to fundamental rights here in the United States. I encourage us to return to these words and breathe new life and meaning into them for our time and generation as well. Here's the poem. When a deed is done for freedom, through the broad earth's aching breast runs a thrill of joy prophetic, trembling on from east to west. Through the walls of hut and palace shoots the instantaneous throw, when the travail of the ages rings earth's systems to and fro. At the birth of each new era with a recognizing start, nation wildly looks at nation standing with mute lips apart. And glad truth's yet mightier one child leaps beneath the future's heart. So the evil's triumph sendeth with a terror and a chill, under continent to continent, the sense of coming ill. For mankind are one in spirit, and in instinct bears along round the earth's electric circle the swift flash of right or wrong. Whether conscious or unconscious, yet humanity's vast frame through its ocean's sundered fibers feels the gush of joy or shame. In the gain or loss of one race, all the rest have equal claim. Once to every soul and nation comes the moment to decide, in the strife of truth with falsehood for the good or evil side. Though the cause of evil prosper, yet 'tis truth alone is strong. And albeit she wander outcast now, I see around her throng troops of beautiful tall angels to enshield her from all wrong. Backward look across the ages and the beacon moments see, that like peaks of some sunk continent jut through oblivion's sea. Careless seems the great avenger, history's pages but record one death grapple in the darkness twixt old systems and the word. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. We see dimly in the present what is small and what is great, slow of faith, how weak an arm may turn the iron helm of fate. But the soul is still oracular amid the market's din. List the ominous stern whisper from the Delphic cave within. Then to side with truth is noble when we share her wretched crust, ere her cause bring fame and profit, and 'tis prosperous to be just. Then it is the brave one chooses, while the coward stands aside. Count me o'er earth's chosen heroes, they were souls that stood alone, while the ones they agonized for hurled the contumelious stone. Stood serene, and down the future saw the golden beam incline to the side of perfect justice, mastered by their faith divine. But we make their truth our falsehood, thinking that hath made us free, hoarding it in moldy parchments while our tender spirits flee. New occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncouth. They must upward still and onward, who would keep abreast of truth. Lo, before us gleam her campfires, we ourselves must pilgrims be, launch our freedom and steer boldly through the desperate winter sea, nor attempt the future's portal with the past's blood-rusted key. There's a lot of ideas in that poem about what one is called to do in the moment, to take a courageous stand for justice, about the need to continually reinterpret our sources of truth and meaning to respond to the historical circumstances we face in the present. So after reading that poem, I want to invite us into a moment of shared silent meditation as we think about what this poem calls us to do in our time, in our historical moment, in the present crisis of now. and how we can apply its lessons to the world that we have inherited. Please join me in a brief moment of silence. Our second hymn this morning is number 140 in the hymnal, Hail the Glorious Golden City. Today's sermon is called The Mountaintop. Dear First Parish, I have a nerd sin to confess. I've never read the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, to many people, this may seem like no big deal, but for someone who has spent his life in the company of sci-fi and fantasy nerds of all descriptions, I tell you, this is not the kind of fact you lead with at parties. But it's true. I've never read the books, at least not all the way through. Compounding my crime still further, I saw the movies before I'd even attempted to read the books, and that may be what ruined them for me. In my defense, the Peter Jackson movie adaptations of The Lord of the Rings came out when I was still a kid. They were close to the defining film event of my generation, impossible to miss. And after I had watched them, I made every good faith effort to read the books on which they were based. But I just couldn't quite get into it. I kept contrasting whatever I read unfavorably with the beloved film version in my head, resenting anything that was different. Who is this Tom Bombadil, I kept thinking. Why is he getting so much airtime? But the worst thing about the books to my childhood mind was the way that they ended. Spoiler warning here, but if you ever look ahead in The Return of the King, as I periodically did in trying to read it, wondering when it would finally be over, you may recall that what many of us think of as the climax of the story, namely the moment when Frodo finally destroys the ring, vanquishes Sauron, and saves Middle-earth, doesn't actually occur in the novel's final chapter, or in the chapter before that, or even in the one before that. Indeed, there is still a good third of the book or so remaining, even after Frodo destroys the ring. What happens during all of that, I would think to myself, staring at this vast expanse of prose? The story is supposed to be over, but instead there's something called the Scouring of the Shire, whatever that is, and a bunch of other stuff that I don't remember from the movies. A common complaint of theatergoers back in 2003, when The Return of the King first played to audiences worldwide, was that it had, quote, too many endings. The hobbits are rescued by eagles, fade to black. Aragorn is crowned king, fade to black. The hobbits are reunited in jump up and down on Frodo's hospital bed in Rivendell, fade to black. And there are 4 or 5 others even beyond that. Too many endings, viewers cried. And while they may have had a point about this, all I can say is that this drawn-out finish in the film version is nothing compared to the one J.R.R. Tolkien gave us in print. In the books, after Frodo and Sam destroy the ring in the crack of Mount Doom, they still have to walk all the way home, only to discover that the war is not really over. Sauron may be defeated, but his lesser follower Saruman, the evil wizard, is still working mischief in their home community of the Shire, alongside the traitorous Grima Wormtongue. As a kid, I had no patience for any of this. The story's over, I'd say. They beat the main bad guy. It's time to pack it up and call it a day. As I've gotten older, however, I have a renewed appreciation for this way of ending the trilogy. Not enough appreciation to actually read the remainder of the book, I confess, but enough to see what Tolkien was perhaps trying to convey. Because while it is true that his approach in the remaining third of Return of the King defies our storytelling conventions, perhaps Tolkien's ending is truer in its own way to real life. This insight has come back to me time and again over the last couple of years. Our society has, after all, been through a lot in that time, much like the people of Middle-earth during the War of the Ring. Let's see, since about this time 2 years ago, we've had a global pandemic, historic nationwide protests against racism and police brutality, a president who refused to concede an election to his successor, an attempted insurrection at the nation's capital, the violent end of one disastrous war in Afghanistan, and the start of another still unfolding one in Ukraine. The looming destruction of a legal framework that has protected women's reproductive health care rights for the last 50 years. And looming particularly large in my own professional world at UUSC, an ongoing shutdown of asylum access at the southern US border that has caused a humanitarian crisis for thousands of people who are just looking to survive and seek safety. Whew. In short, we've been in a lot of situations in the past 2 years when, whatever our opinions or our politics might be, we must have felt some version of the following. Wow, when are the good guys just going to win so that this story can be over? This longing for victory and release, this desire for Frodo to destroy the ring, metaphorically speaking, and bring the whole tale to a close, has come to me again and again over these past years. And always when I think about it, I imagine it as this kind of single moment of joy when all my hopes will be fulfilled. The relief will come crashing down upon me in waves. Trapped indoors under lockdown in the spring of 2020, I would think to myself, just imagine the day when the pandemic is over and we can all get vaccines. Imagine how great that will feel. Total relief from fear. Or during the lead up to the inauguration 2021, I kept thinking we just need to get to January 6th, then Congress will certify the votes and all this scary talk about martial law and overturning the results will end. Or take Title 42, an issue about which I've been praying for victory for a long time. In my current professional life, as I mentioned, I've been working day in and day out with UUSC to call for an end of Title 42 restrictions at the border that are currently blocking asylum seekers from accessing their right to humanitarian protection. Working with grassroots partners on the border, we knew the horror that this policy was causing. By stranding vulnerable migrants and refugees in border encampments with no way forward, the policy was putting countless innocent people, including families with children, at risk of kidnapping and extortion or worse. Cartels and other criminal groups were known to lie in wait for people who were expelled under this policy. In a real sense, therefore, Title 42 was delivering people to danger. But there was also reason to hope. President Biden had promised on the campaign trail to restore asylum, so we kept faith that the decision to finally lift the Title 42 policy might still come any day, at any moment. And whenever I envisioned that moment of relief, I again pictured it as this single, concentrated instant of joy and vindication. It would be like Frodo reaching the top of the mountain at last, casting the ring into lava in the crack of Mount Doom. Evil would be vanquished. Shadow would pass from the land. I thought, as I say, that moment might come when the COVID-19 vaccine was finally available, but as we know, it turned out to be not so simple as that to beat this pandemic. While the availability of the vaccine has saved countless lives and made all of our lives safer and less restricted, it also wasn't enough to end the pandemic on its own. The virus continued to mutate, and we have been through 2 major outbreaks of new variants of the virus, all since the vaccine became widely available. There was no consummating moment, no single flood of relief when we could finally say, as of now, the worst is over. So too with the election. I'd look forward to January 6th as the day when the system would finally work, we'd confirm the peaceful transfer of power, our democratic institutions would be safe. But once again, this victory was not total. Relief did not come. Congress did certify the votes, but only in the face of a riot, invasion of the Capitol building, and the false allegations of a stolen election that have continued beyond that day and right up to the present. So too with so many forms of social progress that many of us thought had been won permanently. The constitutional right to an abortion established for 50 years and critical as Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said to women's full participation as equal members of society. This hard-fought victory that I, for one, no doubt naively, thought had been achieved long ago before I was born and for all time, is now in jeopardy again. And other victories for justice and progress, marriage equality, trans rights, rights to privacy, and contraception are being threatened as well. We live in an age of recrudescent problems. Victories we thought were achieved are in question again. Things we thought had been agreed upon and established, basic tenets of democracy and fundamental rights, are being challenged anew. Even the Cold War, which I grew up thinking had ended just about the time I was born, is seemingly upon us again, following Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Or with Title 42 again, an apparent victory came, but it proved more elusive than it seemed. The CDC did finally terminate the policy on April 1st, declaring that it should end on May 23rd. I rejoiced, my colleagues rejoiced, our partners at the border rejoiced, to be sure. But the delay in implementing the policy's drawdown concerned me. I knew a lot could happen between now and May 23rd, and lo and behold, a lot did. The media misleadingly reported inflated border statistics, creating a false impression of looming chaos in the event the Title 42 order was ended. Then the legal efforts to keep Title 42 in place began, with several states filing a court case to maintain it. Then the legislative efforts to keep it in place began, with politicians from both major parties signing onto a bill that would keep the pandemic-era asylum blockade in effect indefinitely. That's when I began to realize my moment of consummate relief was not going to come in one flash. There would be no single day when everyone would just burst out singing and horror would be dispelled in an instant. Perhaps the world did not, after all, work that way. Perhaps instead the world was more like the one that J.R.R. Tolkien depicts in the closing sections of Return of the King. Even after a victory is won, that is to say, injustice can still be found, even after the Sauron is defeated, you still have to go home and contend with the Sarumans and the Wormtongues. This is a bummer, but maybe it's how the world has always been. Maybe life doesn't promise to deliver us moments of universal singing and joy. It doesn't give us final victories where everything is finally restored and set to rights. It doesn't give us those mountaintop moments when we reach the peak of Mount Doom and destroy the ring. What does it give us instead? It gives us climbs up receding peaks, but with respites and joys along the way, and maybe that is enough. Let me explain what I mean. I think of the words of Martin Luther King Jr. The day before he was assassinated, on April 3rd, 1968, Dr. King spoke to an audience of striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, of how he had, quote, been to the mountaintop. But he used this not to convey the sense I had in mind above, i.e., that of having finally arrived, of having achieved true victory. To the contrary, Dr. King knew that true racial justice, true social justice, was still a long way off, if indeed it could be reached in a final form at all. To him, the mountaintop image conveyed something very different. It was an allusion to the death of Moses, who, in biblical legend, perishes within sight of the promised land, but never quite able to reach it. With uncanny prescience, Dr. King knew that he would not live to reach the promised land himself. The next day, he would be killed by an assassin's bullet. But he said he could see the destination from where he stood. Dr. King's life was ended all too early by the forces of racism, entrenched white supremacy. Events this weekend underlined how present and what a grave danger that violence still is in our society. But there's a broader sense too, irrespective of any individual biography, in which I think every human life or endeavor ends within glimpse of, but never quite having attained that promised land. In what sense do I mean this? Namely, that human beings have a longing for the infinite and the incomplete. We are not happy with that which is static and stationary. There is no one fixed state we can attain, no final equilibrium from which we can say, now we have it. From this moment forward, we are happy, we are perfect. Instead, whatever the state we attain is, we tire of it, we move on, we seek more. Some people channel this longing for the infinite into a quest for infinite money or infinite power. There's never enough to satisfy, they always seek more. Some religious movements exploit this longing for infinity. They make false promises to comprehend the infinite or to be able to command the forces of the infinite for a price, in particular in exchange for loyalty and unthinking faith, the root of much religious intolerance in this world. But it is also possible to channel that human striving for the infinite into ideals. True justice, the final reign of right, as the hymn we just heard put it. Peace on earth. Not a single one of these things is actually some one specific state of affairs that we will one day achieve. Rather, they are all directions in which we can strive over time, knowing that we will never fully reach them. We will not wake up one day and find that the world is at perfect peace. But we know what actions and conditions bring us closer to such a world and which ones carry us further away from it. Once I have processed my grief at the lack of a final and total victory on any of the social justice issues I care about, this is what I always come back to. Title 42 didn't just end one day. Asylum wasn't just restored. People weren't all suddenly able to access their rights. But I know what it looks like to go further in that direction. I know that more people accessing protection, more lives saved, more parts of the government and society working to restore asylum is a good thing. And we can measure incremental progress in that direction. The same goes for every social justice issue. So too with COVID-19, perhaps we will not soon see a moment in which the virus is just entirely vanquished and no longer a threat anywhere to human life, but we can see more lives saved by vaccines, masks, and other public health mitigation measures along the way. More aspects of what we value in our lives restored to a state approaching normal. The image that comes to my mind once again is one of climbing mountains. But this time, it's not Mount Doom, it's not the mountaintop. It's a mountain without a top. Back when I was first starting at UUSC, I wanted to get into the spirit of the profession that I was joining, so I read a book that has influenced many generations of progressive organizers and social justice advocates. It's Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. Alinsky, a labor and civil rights organizer who created much of the model of community organizing that we still use at faith-based institutions today, had a wry and weathered view of life when it came to his work. By the time he wrote the book, he was a veteran of decades of social justice struggles, ranging from labor disputes in the stockyards of Chicago to farm worker protests in the fields of California. He had lived through enough of these, that is to say, to realize that no victory in any struggle is final. There's always more work to be done beyond that. He therefore wrote, quote, "If we think of life as a climb up a mountain, then we must visualize a mountain with no top. We see a top, but when we finally reach it, the overcast rises and we find ourselves merely on a bluff. The mountain continues on up. Now we see the real top ahead of us and strive for it, only to find that we've reached another bluff, the top still above us. And so it goes on. Unlike the chore of the mythic Sisyphus, however, this challenge is not an endless pushing up of a boulder to the top of a hill only to have it roll back again, the chore to be repeated eternally. Rather, it is pushing the boulder up an endless mountain, but unlike Sisyphus, we are always going further upward. Simply, this is the very nature of life, that it is a climb, and that the resolution of each issue in turn creates other issues born of flights which are unimaginable today. The pursuit of happiness is never ending. Indeed, happiness lies in the pursuit." End quote. We do not get a final mountaintop, Alinsky says. We get bluffs that provide us a moment's respite and joy before continuing our journey, but he seems to imply perhaps we should not have it any other way. It's the nature of human beings to strive after that which is forever out of reach. Our happiness is found as much in the striving as in the sitting still. And since we must strive, let us strive for righteousness. Since we must climb, let us climb after justice. Since we must struggle, let us struggle for peace. Let us seek that mountaintop even though it recedes before us. Let us journey toward the promised land even if it may be our fate to fall when it is still just barely coming into sight. May it be so. We will now have our offertory.
Suzanne, I was going to ask you to lead the doxology. I'm sorry, you have to get going. Oh, I'm sorry. Our Unitarian Universalist churches are self-supporting. Your gifts of time, faith, love, and of money is what sustains the work of the church. The morning's offering will now be taken and gratefully accepted, and it shouldn't take long if you don't mind leading us into doxology.
From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of love and faith arise. Let peace, goodwill on earth be sown, through every land, by every tongue. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I invite you to join me as well in our words as we extinguish the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Our final hymn this morning is number 143, Not in Vain the Distance Beacons.
Not in vain the distant beacons, forward, let us range. Let the great word speak forever, down the ringing grooves of change. Through the shadow of the globe we sweep ahead to heights sublime. Leave the cares of former ages in the foremost clouds of time. For we see the present promise of that Spirit has not said. Ancient founts of inspiration well through all our fancies yet, and we doubt not through the ages one increasing purpose runs, and the thoughts of all are widened with the process of the suns. Yea, we dip into the future, far as human eye can see the vision of the world and all the wonder that shall be. Hear the war drum from no longer, see the battle flags unfurled in the parliament of freedom, federation of the world.
Our closing words are from a 19th century Unitarian poet, Arthur Hugh Clow. He's writing at a time in Europe when many liberal and democratic struggles had been set back by repression. He encouraged his contemporaries to trust that the struggle was not in vain. He wrote, "Say not the struggle naught availeth, the labor and the wounds are vain. The enemy faints not nor faileth, and as things have been, they remain. If hopes were dupes, fears may be liars. It may be in yon smoke concealed, your comrades chase even now the flyers, and but for you possess the field. For while the tired waves vainly breaking seem here no painful inch to gain, far back through creeks and inlets making comes silent, flooding in the main. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front, the sun climbs slow, how slowly. But westward, look, the land is bright. May it be so.